I'm really thrilled about our lecture today. And I think everyone at UNC Charlotte is aware of how we run things now. And Greer, of course, is an expert on Zoom webinars. So thank you for all of that work setting this up, Greer. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to share with everyone who's in the space with us today. So Betsy West, who has been a coordinator of this year's lecture series, is with us. And I'm very pleased to welcome Melanie Redrick, who's a professor and architect with Little, and she's teaching at UNC Charlotte this spring, second year studio, and her students have joined us as well for questions and answers after the lecture. And just to remind everyone, since this is a webinar, for those of you who aren't participating as panelists, we do want to hear from you too. Again, we may not be able to get to your questions, but if you have them, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I should say maybe Melanie will moderate and kind of see how that fits in with the timing. It'd be great. So I'll just get started by introducing David. It's a tremendous pleasure to have him with us. I haven't seen Professor Brown since we were just talking since I was last in Houston, or we were last in Houston together. So it's been a while, but you know, what a great opportunity to reconnect virtually. David Brown is a professor at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Architecture. He works on the available city, the potential of Chicago's 15,000 city-owned vacant lots as a collective space system, an urban design, and a future we can have today. Its non-hierarchical, flexible, and variable approach develops from his study of design implications of structures that facilitate improvisation in jazz. Iterations of Professor Brown's speculative design have been exhibited in the 2012 Venice Architecture Biennale and the 2015 Chicago Architecture Biennial. His essays and drawings presenting the transformative impact the available city can have on Chicago's South and West Sides are found in Center 18, Music and Architecture, Architecture and Music, the Oxford Handbook of Critical Improvisation Studies, Volume 2, and Flat Out 4. Those essays advance his study of design and structures in jazz that facilitate improvisation, which he initiated in the book Noise Orders with University of Minnesota Press in 2006. Professor Brown was named the artistic director of the 2021 edition of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which is thematically based on this work. And I just want to emphasize that point. I'm aware of very few expositions of this kind based on an individual's work. So I think that's a huge honor, and we're very honored to have you with us today, David.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk in front of all of you. And I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen and get started. And I will say too, I will be talking about the available city. It is a work that I've been working on for just over 10 years. I started in 2008. Part of that first effort was just being able to produce a map of the lots, something that's made easier now. Technology has kind of caught up with me. If you were doing it today, it wouldn't take you multiple years to just map them, but I will start from there. So in a way, I'm going to talk about the available city and how it's manifested itself in 3 prior biennials, or 1 biennale and 2 biennials, and then how it will be a part of the current, or is the current biennial. And in a way here, this is really a drawing that I've done that's really just talking about the basic principle, which is really identifying from somebody's work on Philadelphia, the notion of the contagion effect, saying that one vacant lot can negatively affect the 8 properties surrounding it. And so then I also just began to conjecture, well, if you put a structure back in place similar to what's already drawn in that kind of set of houses, that what you would get is really not necessarily a positive, but you really just get the neutral condition, our expectation of what should be there. But then I really started to think about, could you in fact begin to introduce more of what I consider a catalyzing agent, and so have a positive or a plus effect on the 8 properties that are surrounding. So quickly, just to kind of go through the basic principles of the available city. I started by articulating an idea that you could have collective spaces as that positive agent, and that would really be through a set of surfaces, which are really more spaces that I envisioned as being implemented by community organizations within different neighborhoods. And then you could also have development of buildings, which would have collective space as volumes within combinations of one city lot and up to 4 other private lots, or 4 city lots and 1 private lot. So in essence, a 25 by 125. A standard Chicago lot is 25 feet by 125 feet. And so that begins to give you possibilities within a single block or a stretch of vacant land, similar to what you see here, that could manifest itself in the 6 different ways, 7 different ways that I've shown here, plus other combinations too. And in general, really just starting to define collective space relative to this project as the space that's conditioned by a kind of work activity that might take place on the surface or within the surrounding building. And how that results in a kind of development of a larger public accessible system that possesses form and activities that begin to be varied enough to accommodate diverse participants. I'll say too, this is because it does begin to involve community organizations as well as private development. I think of it as a publicly accessible system, even though it's utilizing public land, and that the public land brings this kind of collective space easement. But I also don't say public space because I think it immediately brings to mind, I think within most individuals who hear that term, an idea of park or plaza, and really trying to foreground that collective space could in fact be something else. And so then these were just some drawings that were done very early on to begin to talk about in a similar set of blocks, the possibilities for hardscapes, softscapes, small buildings as these kind of surface conditions. And then in some cases, thinking that there would be places where, say, 2 residents didn't necessarily, or residents to both sides of a vacant lot might not want something there. And so fills begins to be a way in which you could still have a collective space that's working a little bit more passively compared to actively, through just kind of fence sculptures or bird houses that begin to limit how much people can pass through that lot, but at the same time activate the sidewalk edges. And then also that some of these could begin to operate in relationship to one another and describe smaller systems across multiple blocks within a set of streets. And these are just to give you some better indication of some of the elements that were drawn. Throughout this process, I have always worked with both graduate students and undergraduate students. And so I won't necessarily claim that I drew every one of these. I made choices. I made editing choices about, in some ways, just what are points of refinement, but also decisions about, no, I just don't like that one, and it just never made the cut. But this was consistently developed in conjunction with different students along the way. in part too, because the challenge is to try to envision a variety of spaces. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of how do you exceed your own thinking in terms of trying to think through a broad number of collective spaces. So then this drawing is really starting to indicate the set of rules. So I'm really in this image showing only the rules for 4 city vacant lots and 1 private. But we developed these rules for each lot combination that there could possibly be between private and public land. And so in essence, for volumes of buildings, the collective, the city-owned property begins to be a kind of easement. And so if you're using 4 city lots, you actually begin to get a large volume of collective space and surface area that you would need to provide within your building or in relationship to your building. And then as you exceed 7 stories, you would actually have to begin to provide additional collective space based on desired height. And that's both in surface area and volume. So in a way, in this combo, you would end up with the equivalent of 5. If you went to the max, you would end up with the equivalent of 5 lots of surface area that equals the collective space and a volume of collective space that's about 40% of the building. These just quickly are variations for each of the rules in terms of a possible massing that could take place. And why all of those variables are important is because this is the landscape that I'm talking about. The dark blue, and I'll show details in a moment, are city-owned vacant lots in 2011. At the time, there were 15,000. I believe currently there are about 13,000. When I say that some lots have been sold, the lots that have been sold exceed 2,000. But I think over that same period of time, the city has acquired additional lots. So the number actually always fluctuates, which is why I think currently now I just really refer to 10,000 plus city-owned vacant lots. But at the time too, in drawing these maps, we could identify that there was other vacant land, which we just designated as private. I suspect some of that has now been acquired by the city. So this map may not have the full accuracy that it once had, but if you assume a 25 by 125 lot and multiply that by 15,000, you get something that's about the size of the downtown core or the loop, which is what's indicated in the dark blue. And then there's just roughly, and that was mapped relative to the city's database at the time. And then just by visual reference, it seems like there's about the same amount of private vacant land. So in a way, this project has the potential impact on an area that's twice the size of the loop, but across principally about currently 18 neighborhoods on the south and west sides have about 70% of that land. And there is a kind of correlation between that land and kind of most of those neighborhoods are 50% below the city's median income. And they are primarily Black and brown neighborhoods as well. These are just showing a couple of details. The west side detail again. So you can begin to see how the composition of, or this kind of inadvertent composition of vacant land that's private and public manifests. So to me, just as a point of reference to things, historical reference, one could also look at something like Hilbersheimer's proposal for Marquette Park, in which he talks about really the blocks of Chicago giving way through erasure of streets to being one type of order in which land is kind of bounded by the city, compared to in the final image, which is almost emulates what most of our suburbs look like today. land in which the city is kind of placed or overlaid through a kind of laddered system, to use Albert Pope's term. So in some ways, Hilbersheimer was projecting an orderly erasure of the city, when in fact, we've had a very disorderly erasure of the city. And so in a way, it's not as easy to project to me, it's not as easy to project an urban design idea across that space, because it's hard to actually know the details of what's adjacent to 10,000 plus properties. So that's where this project begins to intersect with my interest in jazz and improvisation. So this is a composition by George Lewis, a trombonist who's known for free improvisation work and is a member of an organization here in Chicago. He's now based in New York, called the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which started in the 60s and produced groups such as the Art Ensemble of Chicago, and really, I would say a number of other musicians. Anthony Braxton is maybe another musician that some of you may have heard of, Henry Threadgill. And it's an organization that now continues to operate in Chicago and New York. The idea of this composition, though, is that a group of musicians would actually move through this grid, playing in response to one another. But the decisions about how they move through the grid is up to them. So you could go column by column, or you could go row by row, or you could do some other pattern across in your response. And some of those decisions may be just made in relationship to what's being played at the time. So a composition that provides an organizing structure, but ultimately doesn't necessarily fully dictate all of the qualities and characteristics of what's played. So to me, I think the available city is similar. There are a set of rules and relationships about single lots and multiple lots in relations that are city owned in relationship to private lots, but how that would actually take place in the form of a city is something that's a kind of unknown quantity until it actually unfolds. And it unfolds in a way that's not necessarily linear, that it could in fact take place issuing forth from multiple neighborhoods and multiple locations at the same time and slowly coming together. So it is, to me, open in time frame. It's highly scalable and flexible and variable in its outcome. And to a degree, actually gains impact if in implementing one or two spaces, the surrounding residents and community organizations have the opportunity to begin to critique those and project about others. And so how that may in fact begin to inform the development of other spaces, as well as potentially the development of spaces within buildings. And so you get both this kind of diverse possibility of spaces, but also diverse participation that can occur. And so to me, it is a collective space system that could be highly varied and have a high impact on what the city looks like over time. So with that, I'm now going to talk about the three instances of the three prior instances of the project within biennials, and then the fourth, which is now in development. I think as I do so, I may not reference this fully, but in a way it's gone from being part of an exhibit with 4 other projects as a kind of urban speculation to the basis of an exhibition by others in response to the available city, and then a set of workshops within another biennial to develop 2 spaces, and then from that, the available city as the biennial itself. So here, this is really what you would view first in encountering this in the Arsenale at the Venice Architecture Biennale back in 2012. This was organized by Alexander Eisenschmidt. Really, what you see here is out on the perimeter is a drawing of his in terms of a collection of possible Chicagos from all of the imaginary buildings that were projected for the city collected into one drawing. I think there is a Marina City on the right, but maybe not the Marina City that was constructed compared to the Marina City that was initially drawn. And then in the interior, you can see there's a model, and that model is really contributions by Studio Gang, Urban Lab, Stanley Tigerman, and myself. So you would kind of walk around this drawing, tuck your head under and go inside. And so here you can see the different models. The available city is the third one in. So Studio Gang was looking more at the lake and river. Urban Lab, a little bit more kind of the coast and water remediation. The available city, looking a little bit more at streets. And Stanley Tigerman's work looking a little bit more at blocks. So just to go through these. So in a way, within the first biennial, it's really this kind of composite city based off of 4 ideas about urbanism from 4 different designers. And this is really the model, which was exploration of the idea of the collective spaces through this kind of double acrylic or double resins in terms of colored resins and opaque or translucent. And then also in the edges, really trying to look within the edge of the model at details of collective spaces in one building and how they might link up to collective spaces within another building. And this is just from the other end and the same thing. And then within the larger model, looking at some similar instances where you have 2 different buildings abutting up against one another and suggestions of collective spaces that link both in interior and exterior. The same here. Just looking some at surface conditions too. And then how some of those surface conditions might link up relative to buildings. But there were drawings as well, but as you could see in the prior images, and even in this image outside the one person in white to the right, most everybody looked at the model rather than the drawings. But the drawing was, this was really the first presentation of the available city. And so really was trying to talk about this urban idea of the basic principle, how you could start with a few collective spaces. And then so here, the basic principles, the drawings that I've showed. Here a little bit that you could have a starting collection in the lower left of collective spaces on single surfaces. And then over time, you might get additional ones as you move to the upper right. And then over time, you could in fact get collective spaces across the whole system or across the whole set of spaces. If that happened, you would have a collective space system or field within the city that's equal to the loop in size. Or you could also begin to get these buildings manifesting. If you had a high concentration of buildings over time, you'd actually have a collective space system that exceeds the size of the loop. So this is just going to go through those a little bit more in detail or close up. So that starting point could lead to this or reduced scale. It could lead to this. Subsequently, I started to really think about the question of how do you begin to think outside of typical thoughts as to what collective spaces could be. So this is, to a degree, a kind of periodic table that tries to provide words and phrases that could suggest possibilities for space. Moving a little bit more in kind of the yellow from form ideas to words that operate as verbs and nouns, to a little bit more other types of verbs and descriptions, And so moving more towards program, and then in some ways on the bottom column, outliers that are really just kind of phrases that are common. It sounded like, or it smelled like, while supplies last, phrases that mobile network, phrases we maybe encounter every day, but if you think about them in the context of collective space, what do they trigger? So this is just quickly showing those. And so this was meant to be something that you could use in play as a form of tangram perhaps, or some other game. And then from that set of words, did it suggest collective space ideas? I think I'm the only one who really spends time with this or gets it. I've tried it out on 200 level students and they all just kind of look at me perplexed. But, another way in which I started to really try to think about the collective space volume was to say, well, you could have types of ready-mades where you knew what the volume and surface area was. And so rather than just thinking of it as that there's a volume from which, or a mass from which you extract volume, that you could really assemble parts in relationship to one another, and that they would, in fact, in essence, describe what that collective space could be as a volume within a building. And then also begin to realize that not everyone that maybe would want to acquire vacant land would want to build to the limits of what was proposed, and that you might get speculation that staying at the acquire as much land as possible, but don't go above 4 stories. And so really starting to look at how those buildings too could begin to suggest or organize collective space. So in 2015, that work was exhibited at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. So most of that new information, as well as some of the information from 2011, you can see to the left. And then an expanded field of the axonometric. And I do think of these as instances relative to what I'm talking about in terms of improvisation. That from drawing to drawing, parts move around to different positions. This one begins to incorporate some of the smaller 4-story elements. You'll see that a little bit more here. But that they're really more projections of what it could look like compared to projections of what it would look like. So in that way, iterations. And then these are the models, or a continuation of the model studies, but really thinking about what might be the relationship of 3 different buildings and how their exterior forms might add up to look like something that's one element or one consistent element. How the interior collective spaces across a set of volumes could in fact have a kind of complementary consistency, or that you could just have a jumble of parts that connect, both on exterior and interior. As I mentioned, in this exhibition, which was a sub-exhibition within the biennial called BOLD, which was about new ideas for Chicago, Iker Heel of Moss Context organized really the contribution of other designers within the city to make projections or speculations relative to the available city. I should say it was fortuitous that I had started to really think about the below 4-story possibilities. I think maybe because of time frame a little bit, that's what most everybody did in response, in terms of really looking at how low level or low height buildings could describe collective space, with the exception of Helmut Jahn's office, where they really maximized the height in terms of looking at a collective space system that was distributed throughout that building, 13-story building. And so this is just a little bit of that context of how the two were exhibited in relationship to one another. And so from that, just going back through that starting instance, you can again get the intensive system of collective spaces across surfaces. You could also begin to incorporate these smaller 4-story or small, shorter buildings. And then these larger buildings as well. And then also, as I started to, over time, realize to foreground that this could in fact begin to incorporate groves and or urban farms. And so really trying to think about those in relationship to what I had been speculating on before. And so really saying, well, there's maybe 4 modalities within the proposal. In some, based on levels of intensity of perhaps investment. So there's low intensity culture, which is primarily surfaces, high intensity culture, which are the buildings. And then low intensity cultivation might be more of a grove, and high intensity cultivation more farming. And then I really started to focus at that point on trying to realize a set of spaces. So projected it in North Lawndale, which is where I had done an exhibit on that neighborhood in 2006 for the Chicago Architecture Center. And so in presenting this to a set of organizations in North Lawndale, CCA Academy expressed interest along with MLK District Garden. Both of those are permaculture parks or gardens. This one focusing on fruit trees and bushes primarily. But really trying to think of this as something that could operate as a park. And so we're asking for a little bit of an outdoor classroom that could occur within it. And so as part of the biennial, I asked if I could do some workshops. This is in 2019. So at that point was able to invite Antonio Torres, a colleague, to lead a set of workshops and really go on to become the designer. He's part of Bittertang, so they are working on the design of this space. But that was through matching what that group, CCA Academy, was expressing as the goals for the garden. They actually wanted the outdoor classroom to be something that was an active part of the garden in terms of participating in its growth. And that is something that Bittertang focuses on or looks at within their work. And then in another garden, MLK District Garden, their permaculture garden is more mature and has this aspect of, as you can see in these photos, in the summer, maybe looking a little wild. Especially if you look in the lower left, you cannot see the shipping container, but then in the winter, once everything goes dormant, it looks like a vacant lot again. And as you look across, you can maybe see the shipping container in the distance, just to give you a sense of how much it varies. So they were interested in a fence that began to give greater sense of how one could navigate through, and then how that began to impact. Also providing an identity that complements its growth in the summer and then is the identity maybe more in the winter. And so then a set of workshops. Here I asked Anya Jaworska and Eric, an architect, and Eric Hotchkiss, an industrial designer, to work on it. And so that led to, these are 2 pinups in the biennial for about 2 weeks each. Of the work that was developed. But I think it's through that work coupled with a workshop that I did also in North Lawndale for the site that you see outlined in green, a hard surface play lot. That one done via Zoom, as you can see in the lower right image. But that led to, I think, the invitation to be the artistic director for this biennial. This biennial being the available city. And when I say that, I think there was the thinking of that it already, I had already identified some potential spaces, had begun to work with designers on those spaces. And I think demonstrating that for me, it is the interest as the kind of urban designer in the project. I'm not so interested in designing any one space. as much as really working with organizations to identify spatial possibilities and then match them to designers who I think would do something that's kind of sympathetic and or exceeds their expectations in terms of what those spaces could be. I should say, so the fence had morphed into a set of benches and archways. So it really creates collective space along the sidewalk, as well as talks about how you would enter in and find other spaces in the interior. And so I would say too, I do think of this edition of the biennial as a way, going back to some of the images that I showed before, of really initiating the urban design. So in a way, really thinking of the biennial as an urban design tool or an urban design structure. And when I say that, some of the components will be, and this harkens back to the third Venice Architecture Biennale, which Aldo Rossi was the artistic director for, in which for that biennial, there was a call for ideas relative to, I think, 16 sites within Venice or within the surrounding area. And that was an invitation to architects as well as students in schools of architecture. And so I think they received about 1,300 entries. Within this biennial, we are producing a set of calls that I think will go out in April for ideas for collective space based on, in some ways, types that are a little bit generic, even though I know of organizations that have kind of requested something similar, but in a way phrasing them as something that multiple organizations might have an interest in, and seeing, and so hypothetically saying, well, can designers in response to a set of international calls produce 10,000 ideas for 10,000 spaces? So that's one way in which there will be a kind of effort to realize the available city as a set of, although not necessarily with specific locations. The sites that I was just showing for CCA Academy and MLK District Garden are ones that we're looking to get constructed. There was recently an announcement for the Danish Arts Foundation's contribution is a site that's in North Lawndale, not too far from where the CCA Academy site is. And so really trying to work on spaces within a set of neighborhoods. And that the biennial will really be across many of the neighborhoods that have vacant lots, as well as other neighborhoods around the city. So not, even though the lots are concentrated on the south and west, really just also trying to make it a little bit more of a distributed biennial across the city, and so have a different type of impact. And then the spaces that are built for the biennial would in fact be, as well as other work that's exhibited. The work that's exhibited will really be around 4 themes that are related to the available city as an idea. I'm terming those kind of futures we could have today, which relates to this idea that really the available city is just a recognition of the landscape that could become active through a change in policy and how we understand it, as well as how community organizations can, in fact, you can understand their missions as types of urbanisms. And so how that's the basis for collective spaces. And then referencing the AACM, something patterned, wild and free, or sorry, that's an poet, something patterned, wild and free, as a statement by, or the name of an essay by Robert Hayden, which is more of an improvisational framework, or to me is an improvisational framework. And then by the AACM, the idea of power stronger than itself. So how small elements in aggregate could have an exponential potential. So those aspects are really also the basis for, I think, initiating types of discussions. And so within the biennial, want to have workshops where there can be relationships established between other community organizations and residents with designers, and using the biennial as a platform, being able to take advantage of really organizing sessions that could be international, and thinking of those as really being something that can be more immersive in terms of, rather than a lecture to a large audience, how is it more of a participatory event with a smaller set of individuals? And so I should say too, in some ways, I'm thinking of the biennial as a version of Instant City. In terms of the biennial, in this case, is the blimp or the event, but that it really begins to initiate a set of activities or bring a kind of intensity that leaves behind sets of ideas for collective spaces, some actual collective spaces that would continue to be stewarded by organizations. And then I think workshops that could lead to other spaces, as well as some toolkits that could continue to be utilized for the design of spaces. So that is all I have. Thank you.
Great, David. Very, very exciting. Do you have a sense of when this call will go out?
I think it's going to be in April. And I think that will be with at the same time that there's really announcement of a larger list of participants. And then we haven't really thought through the submission process as well. So I think that all has to get outlined. But I think the ambition is to have about 15 different ideas, and that they could occur on single lots or up to 5 lots. And you could submit to one or all 15. And so and then to really try to, I haven't really figured out, I think that's one of the things that will be ongoing. How do we begin to display that? I think it would become the basis for a kind of catalog of ideas that would be available subsequent to the biennial. And so really just trying to make an open resource.
Great, thank you. I'll hand it over to Melanie.
All right, well, we've been stalking you online for the last couple weeks as a studio, and we've come up with a bunch of really interesting questions. I wanted to start with the question that Nicole's going to ask, because you mentioned about your periodic table of elements and how you feel like you're the only one that understands it sometimes. I mean, we found it really intriguing, so I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, I was just wondering about your exploration of the periodic table and its words, and how it's organized similar to a regular periodic table, and how the elements, whether they create a specific reaction, and how that has implemented in your available city.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's quite as sophisticated as the elements that organize the world and universe, perhaps. But it does. I was looking at the periodic table as a model in terms of really starting to say, well, to one side there may be basic parts, and then they begin to gain types of complexities. And then I think that there are types of outliers as well that don't necessarily follow the full table, that have just been discovered or crop up subsequently, but they aren't necessarily building blocks of neutrons and protons. I'm going to show how little I know about about science. I'm going to leave it at that. I know they've become much more sophisticated in terms of how they talk about neutrons, protons, and electrons. That electrons are no longer just this thing in orbit; they're clouds. But I'm going to leave it at that. But I think really trying to think through what are clusters of ways of thinking. And I think a little bit more, it's more of a periodic table thought through as a designer. So what maybe the complexity is, and how it might spark imagination compared to how they really directly assemble. when I say, I think it's, I can't say anybody else but me has spent time with it. When I've given it out in the classroom, I kind of print a set of tiles, and it's more to have a conversation among students. I print a set of tiles, each one gets a tile, and then they have to talk with their students around them and gather their tiles, and then try to develop some ideas. But I think if somebody were to actually play with it a little bit more thoroughly, it could be generative. Now, when I say that, I think it is a designer tool more than a resident tool, probably.
One thing we thought about when we were looking at it is we were thinking about, like, in just regular elements, when certain things, you put them together and they make a certain reaction. Certain things you don't want them near each other, certain things you do. Have you thought about some of these interactions in terms of how they relate to each other, and maybe start to classify those?
No, I have not. And if anything, I'm more of an advocate currently of almost kind of possibilities for high contrast, or so rather than wanting, let's say, a so I guess to go through, I think within the set of spaces that you will potentially have, one of them would be a little bit more of a memorial site. So in a way, a kind of archive. One of them would be a different type of archive, maybe a little bit more about history. One's in relationship to a farmer's market, but how that market space could be utilized for other types and scales of events. Even the two spaces that I'm talking about, one is an outdoor classroom, maybe has different opportunities for meeting compared to how the MLK one really starts to talk about meetings along the edge. So almost as a garden begins to create a facade, even though it's a facade that's maybe principally at 18 inches height or standard seating height, and then some archways. And so, but to me, how those can begin to be in juxtaposition relative to one another. And so they become more urban as you would move across them. So I guess I would say OMA's Parc La Villette is a kind of reference point too, in terms of the ideas of the project, that as you move across a landscape, you might actually encounter a wide diversity of what collective space could be.
You actually gave a amazing segue into something that Sydney and I have been kind of chatting about back and forth in our Google Doc. She was thinking about your classroom slash garden, so I'll just kind of turn that over to her.
Okay.
Yeah, so just wanted to say, great lecture. I'm really interested in the urban farm proposal because I'm originally from like a farming town, so I feel like we're connecting. So one of the things that you just mentioned was this like outdoor classroom as more of a meeting space. So I was wondering, do you see this classroom as like educating people within the urban farm about like farm to table, or is it more of just like an all-purpose setting that just happens to be within the urban farm, like gardens and things like that?
I will say that the CCA Academy, the group that's organizing the farm, actually does think of it as a way in which the outdoor classroom gathering space promotes awareness of the garden as a place where anyone within the neighborhood could come and collect fruit. And so in a way creates or fosters awareness of healthy eating and gardening. I don't know that they have thought about kind of farm to table. I know those were some discussions that were taking place a little bit more with MLK District Garden early on, that there could be, the spaces could be used for discussions about food prep. And so I think that is something that, but to me, it is more, not necessarily from my standpoint, how I'm thinking about them as much as how the organizations are thinking about them, although also trying to raise those types of questions as they are talking about spaces.
Well, when we go back to kind of periodic table, which I can't get away from, and you started talking about the community organizations and kind of how they are interacting with this project and also with each other. I think that gives a good segue into something William's been thinking about.
Yeah, thank you for coming virtually, I guess, David. It's been a pleasure hearing from you. And I tend to think that something that's effective in the community typically has to involve the community. And so I've been wondering a little bit about like how you've taken part in like bringing them along, and what does it look like to have community involvement in the design process?
That's twofold. It's a challenge. It's been kind of my first challenge for really thinking about the biennial. That I had the spaces that I had already been working with organizations, but then trying to want to increase the number of spaces that could be designed as part of the biennial, really trying to find other possibilities, but wanting that to be from organizations. And in part so that you really can have the spaces that are designed and constructed have the possibility to, for some aspects of them, to remain and be stewarded. But I think it's, to me, it's actually always, I shouldn't say, it's in a way surprising, but I think it's as you gather individuals into a room and I think try to make, provide different opportunities for them to think about the space. It can be surprising the insights that they would begin to have. And so I think it's really just trying to encourage that conversation and say that it is a space in which all ideas are welcome, and having different scales of events. So for both of those, one, CCA asked that their workshops be explicitly for students and take place on a college campus, just so that the students could see a college campus. And we toured the school. They got to talk with some other students. We ended up on the last day, had them paired working one-on-one with an architecture student. So, and the architecture student was really helping to just enable what each student was envisioning. And so I think it's more through kind of the multiple workshops where first just introducing sets of ideas and not having any sort of, just saying these are some things that could happen on the second time, and then also just having discussions of what do people enjoy out of what they're seeing. And then I think for the other site, we toured the site and then came back and had another discussion. And I think it's through that repetition, in that case, that you get effective participation in terms of really people looking to enter into the process and talk about what they would like to see as types of spaces. And I think it's also in some cases too, I think through that repetition, you're just listening to what they are desiring as types of spaces. And then you're showing them that even in that one desire, there's really maybe 10 things that you could quickly pull and show. These are possibilities as to what that might look like and get types of responses. I think one of the things that we're looking at currently in relationship to the toolkit idea is that most of the information you find about how you might utilize vacant land begins to talk about it a little bit more from a standpoint of basic program and how do you implement basic program, but not necessarily including so much about how design and the design of things can impact what are the possibilities for that basic program. And so I think that's part of what the discussion really is, that there's them expressing what they think the space should be. And then you're saying, well, that actually has these 10 different implications or these other different implications. And seeing which ones they respond to and have interest in.
It's really interesting because you're setting up a framework, and unlike a lot of other design projects, you're inviting all these other people in. I mean, designers and also community members. And you've been working on this for about 10 years. So Lyra has some questions for you about like what your next steps are.
Yeah, David. Hello. Thank you for giving a lecture today. My question to you is, where does this Available City project stand today, and what's the timing and phasing looking like right now? And along with future initiatives, what do you think will be the impact of that? And also, what kinds of designers are you looking to gather for this project, and what type of response do you hope to see?
So in a way, I'm hoping that the biennial really does initiate this as an ongoing urban design project. In terms of, I think the biennial enables me to really talk with designers around the world and see, are you interested in thinking about this idea? And potentially contributing a space. But I really am, in terms of selection, it's both a combo of looking for individuals that already seemingly within their work, you see something about collective spaces. And then I think also being attentive to what seemingly are the underlying concerns. So somebody might be talking about the collective space of a porch. And so how does the notion of porch begin to relate to what one organization might say about what they're desiring as a type of gathering space or collective space relative to them. So the same, I should say, so Anya Jaworska had done work on fences, which is why I was like, oh, well, she would be somebody that would be good to ask to design a fence. And then I asked Eric Hotchkiss because I thought there was just some overlap between his work in terms of visual sensibility to a degree. So they would maybe be good in terms of talking with one another. And so I do hope that this becomes a kind of platform where I am able to introduce the Available City no longer as a speculative drawing process as much as a speculative urban design production process. So in some ways becoming a little bit more of a form of practice. I really consider myself an educator researcher at this point. But want to continue this idea of really being able to work with community organizations, understand what they desire as a type of space. How do you match them with a designer? And so how does that, and then how I think through the biennial, I think hopefully being able to enlist support through foundations, having done it at the biennial scale, and so demonstrate that I can do it. So something that could sustain itself. Now, does that mean I get to do 100 spaces between now and 10 years? I haven't, or 1,000 spaces, I have no idea. So I think to me, the Available City it would be an active agent in the city amongst other organizations that are also there. There are urban farm groups that are producing spaces. There are groups that are interested in linear trails, similar to like the High Line, et cetera. So I think it's a complement. I don't expect that the city is going to go ahead and say, yes, you're right, we're going to adopt your plan.
So as you can tell just by this environment that we're in right now, 2020 was pretty unusual. And 2021 is also pretty unusual. So you're kind of taking the helm at a unusual time. And Kendall had some question for you about that.
I was just wondering if there were any specific limiting factors that you think you'll have to push past in order to like successfully realize the goals you have for this project. Any like boundaries or challenges you think that you'll face?
I think the biggest challenge is kind of the is it's all occurring in a tight time frame. So in some ways, with the two sites that I was talking about, those designs started in workshops in 2019, and so I've had time to really kind of incubate and develop. Compared to, I think some of the others will be on a little bit of a faster track. But I think too, fortunately, I think the biennial is starting to think of itself as something that really is highly active for a period every 2 years, but is also consistently active beyond that. So I think in some cases, some of the spaces might be completed a little bit later in the cycle. So it could be that they're done in October, November, rather than September. And some of them might be done a little bit earlier. So I think going ahead and somewhat just thinking of it as the urban design again, saying, well, it's enabling me to pinpoint this September, January moment where there can be a lot of activity, but then also trying to introduce into the biennial some ways of thinking and working that have maybe been minor, but foregrounding them a little bit more. So the idea that workshops could happen that could be about other spaces and how that gets exhibited is one way of thinking about it. I think too, the idea of the calls in terms of really trying to project about spaces and get the kind of diversity that I have ambition for, even though that's not all through direct relationship with community organizations, but still being able to then utilize that to show these are a range of possibilities relative to just 15 basic ideas. And then I think more directly to the pandemic, probably the construction could hit hurdles. I think because we're out in space more than in interiors, there's a little bit of likelihood that it can happen without a lot of constraint. Is there, how many people actually come to the city and visit is a different question mark. But for that, I'm also thinking that we would have some biennial outposts. So really having work that's in the biennial somehow exhibited or communicated in spaces around the world too. So not necessarily centralized to Chicago.
We do have one more question. And, you know, we've been talking about Chicago like this entire time. It's kind of like de facto, but we do have a little bit of interest, well, actually a lot of interest in what got you there specifically. So I'll open it up to Stephanie for the last question.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us this lecture. It's been really great. So it looks like you spent a lot of time in Chicago working to better the city and teaching there. What's your personal connection to Chicago and how does that influence your work moving forward?
So I moved to Chicago, as Blaine was saying. I had been teaching at Rice. And so I moved to Chicago in 2004. And I should say that some of the working ideas started through a set of studios that I was doing at Rice that were looking at some other vacant land conditions there. I think they've changed a little bit. Houston used to go through wild boom and bust cycles with oil. So I think when Blaine and I were there, a lot of Midtown, which is now filled in, was vacant. And so a lot of land just I never did quite have my directions right. North of Bryce's campus was in fact vacant. And then I would say Project Row Houses was starting up, and that's a kind of influence on the project as well. Project Row Houses was started by Rick Lowe and some other artists, in some ways inspired by paintings of shotgun houses in Third Ward by artist John Biggers. And so they started to do a set of installation spaces, but also coupled with that young mother's assistance program and aftercare art program. And that's now slowly spread from kind of a half block to maybe a full block plus some other land around where they have different activities. But in Chicago, I think it's a big city, but I think through the university, and it's a big city that has an architecture history. And so I think has a consistent interest in architecture and a set of organizations that are interested in architecture. So I think just making relationships over time is what's led. I think it was a faculty member in the art history department who said I would be good for the exhibit on North Lawndale, which led to Chicago Architecture Center inviting me to do that exhibit. It's through that exhibit I really got to know residents in North Lawndale and felt comfortable going back to North Lawndale as a neighborhood to focus on when I started to think, oh, this, I could really look at this as something that I can implement. And then also just through other organizations, the Art Institute, MCA, Graham Foundation, which is an international grantor, but based here in Chicago, in a small house. In a not so small house, but ultimately in a small house. And so you just start to, I think by being in the city, that there are three architecture schools directly in the city. So you just start to know a broader network than your own university, and just continue to make connections over time. And then through the biennial, I'm quickly making other connections too.
Well, we definitely appreciate you taking our questions. You've enriched our studio for the last 2 weeks, kind of exploring your work and talking about it. And I'm sure we'll have a good chat after this. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Blaine. Thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking with all of you. And thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. I have this vision, this post-COVID vision of us returning to the city and seeing, I mean, what perfect timing to have Chicago become again a kind of stage as it has been in the past, a kind of city exposition site. And I love the way that your project is both personal and collective, and invites all of us in to imagine what that city or other cities might look like. And on that note, we hopefully can join you in some way, or at least see the biennial. We'd like, if we can, to take our second year studio in the fall to Chicago. So,
and if you do make it, please let me know. It is a big city, but it is easy to get around, and UIC is not so far from the downtown, et cetera. So.
Great.
Do they get to go retroactively since they didn't get to go this year? Our second.
That's right. Yeah, I hope that more than just our, that one class can go for sure. We're excited that things are opening up and there are more possibilities, and who knows, you may get many more people than you expect to come to the biennial as a result. So, but thank you so much today for all the wonderful, thoughtful work, and good luck to you. I'm sure it's going to be a busy time. Let us know if you need any extra hands to help out. And thank you to Melanie, and thank you to all the students participating, and good luck to you also the rest of your semester. And Everyone have a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you. And all of you do the same.